Okay, thanks. I'm Rodolfo Maggio, and I've just completed my PhD from the University of Manchester, PhD in social anthropology. I defended a thesis based on 13 months of fieldwork based in Gilbert Camp, an illegal settlement on the outskirts of Honiara. And so today I will summarize the content of the paper that I circulated about 2 weeks ago, and the title of my presentation is The Value of a Dead Relative, Compensation and Rearrangement of Social Relationships in Honiara, Solomon Islands. I'm very much looking forward to your comments and critique, because my objective at this stage is to convert this chapter of my thesis into a publishable work. So I'm very much looking forward to the Q&A. So the British anthropologist Maxwell Marwick, in his 1965 study on the relationship between the social process and sorcery accusations, argues that sorcery accusations tend to emerge in response to socially stressful situations in which people belonging to a close-knit group are somehow unable to solve a dispute by the judicial procedures available. In a later study, Melanesianist anthropologists Pamela Stewart and Andrew Strathern wrote that in situations of conflict and dispute, gossip and rumor can become powerful weapons in the hands of the disputants. Today, I want to pick on Marwick's position and the subsequent move made by Stewart and Strathern to illustrate how a group of Quarai people from Gilbert Camp, this illegal settlement on the outskirts of Honiara where I conducted my research, how these people managed to turn accusations of malevolent magic into means of enforcing customary law. My argument has important bearings on the ways in which these people are represented by the part of external observers. Indeed, in Gilbert Camp, inhabitants of illegal settlements are often represented by the media, national media, but also international media, or local citizens. They are represented as criminals, and it goes without saying that I don't really buy into these popular caricatures. They are represented as criminals, as unscrupulous squatters, and as violent raiders who can only be tamed with Christianity and can only advance with the help of externally imposed development schemes. In contrast, my intention is to represent them with my thesis as concerned citizens, as inventive creators of feasible solutions to dangerous problems in order to prevent daily tensions to escalate into possibly another turn of ethnic tensions. And I want to represent them as successful mediators between state law and customary law, because such mediation is of particular importance for them today. Since the end of the Second World War, they've been migrating to Honiara from Malaita because they value what lacks in Malaita and can be found in Honiara. And nevertheless, in Honiara, they still would like to live according to their custom. And the story I'm going to tell you today is telling precisely of this effort, of this commitment to live according to their custom, to their traditions, even when such commitment is made more difficult because of conflicts and disputes within the community. In Gilbert Camp, there is no state-based legal system of justice delivery dealing with issues of customary law. So when there is a dispute, the people in Gilbert Camp have to find their own ways to solve it or to cope with it. And the fact that they manipulate elements of Malayan custom in order to realize Quarai values in the non-Quarai context of their peri-urban settlement, to me is an illustration of how strongly they would like to live in a place in which such values are protected and respected. Now, to ground my claims, I have to provide you with some ethnographic material and the analysis thereof. So after this brief introduction, I will tell you about the origins of the conflict in Gilbert Camp and the meeting that was organized to solve it and the outcome. As you know from reading the paper, the story begins with a woman named Rhoda. Rhoda is an unmarried woman who came to live in Gilbert Camp when she was a teenager. In January 2000, she gave money and food to Jacob in exchange for a piece of land. Jacob is or claims to be a landowner, and indeed he receives payment from people in Gilbert Camp who seek to regularize their settlement, but without issuing any proof of the purchase. And so it was for Rhoda, who was asked to give $10,000, but only gave $6,000 because that's the amount she had at the time. So Jacob accorded her some more time to earn the remaining $4,000, and the woman went to live on his land, built a house, and lived there for 6 years. In 2006, a maternal relative of Rhoda died and left behind a young daughter and a house in the adjacent settlement of Kobito. So Rhoda went to live there and rented her house to her sister, Jane, and her sister's husband, Hugh. The two built a store in front of Rhoda's house and lived there with their children for 6 more years. And then, as you know from the paper, a tragic event took place. In the same land area, Ethel was living in the house of her late husband, Robert. And one day in June 2011, Jack, Robert's close cousin, visited Ethel and asked her to be fed and be given a place to sleep. Obviously, the woman couldn't refuse, but the day after, she found him dead in his bed, and nobody could tell what had happened to him. More time passed. 1.5 years later, we change setting, and we see that Jane and Hugh visit Jacob and gave him $10,000 in exchange for that very same piece of land that Rhoda had started to pay, but of which never completed the payment. So, after more than 10 years, Jacob felt fully entitled to forget about that initial purchase and accept the $10,000 from Jane. It was not his business, after all, if in that way Jane was playing a very bad trick on her sister. Because in that way, Rhoda lost $6,000, her land and her house. So that's why, out of revenge, about 1 week later, Rhoda visited Ethel and told her that Jack's death had been actually caused by a sorcery attack thrown by Jane and Hugh. Immediately, Ethel felt the need to speak with George, Jack's brother. As soon as George knew, he immediately went to speak with Nathan, a man he used to call a local chief, and asked him to organize a compensation meeting. The following Sunday, we were all united in the police station. Nathan, in the company of Luke, another man people call a local chief, formally opened the meeting, adding that it was held under the authority of the local chiefs, depositor of customary law, and the police in charge of enforcing the national constitution. Nathan and Luke asked many questions about the sorcery attack and received a multiplicity of contradictory claims. So after more than 2 hours, Nathan declared that no evidence of a sorcery attack had been found. That's when the authorities started to ask questions to interrogate Jane and Rhoda about their dispute over land. And unsurprisingly, in the span of 10 minutes, everything was clear to everybody. To the point that a man who only came later, a man who could only speak Kwarai, gave a brief speech in that vernacular, which Luke translated with the following words: "I have never come across a case of 2 sisters attacking each other in this way. I am very surprised." Hello. Nathan added, "They have made use of the name of our late brother Jack for their personal problems with the land." And Luke concluded with what was going to be the final judgment. "We 4 chiefs sat down and decided what follows. Rhoda shall pay 1 tafuliai to George, and Jane shall pay another one to George, and both Jane and Rhoda shall pay another one to Hugh." So it goes without saying that even after such a summary of such a brief account of the events, many questions arise. Given to the limited amount of time, I will only deal very briefly with these 5 keywords and ask, why was making use of the name of a dead relative seen as a wrongdoing? How should the conflict between the value of land and the value of sisterhood be interpreted in order to reflect the point of view of the Kwarai people of Gilbert Camp? and what is the value of a tafuliae, and how should it be interpreted in order to understand how it articulates the rearrangement of social relationships that is the main outcome of this compensation case. And lastly, I would like to ask, why was Jane seen as much responsible as Rhoda, even if it was Rhoda who apparently caused the big trouble? My interpretation of this material, excuse me, my interpretation of this material is inspired by a conceptual categorization of cases of accusations of malevolent magic developed by Stewart and Strathern, who suggest, as in the first instance, to look at the context. In the context of Gilbert Camp, Jack's death was first experienced as an inexplicable and perhaps natural event. And then, as soon as Rhoda's gossip started to spread around, people started to feel the suspicion that it had been caused by a sorcery attack. And the difference between these two conceptions of death is obviously very marked in Quarai culture. If it is recognized that a person was killed as a consequence of a sorcery attack, for sure, some form of reparation has to take place. And both voluntary compensation and retaliatory violence are considered as appropriate ways to regain the status one has lost as a consequence of taking offense. But if it is not possible to identify the perpetrator and seek reparation from him or her or his relatives, then the victim might decide to kill someone randomly. Nowadays, this institution is completely abandoned, but its principles should be kept into consideration, in my opinion, because it helps to understand that the point of compensation is not necessarily to identify and punish the perpetrator, but rather to restore the value of the victim. That a perpetrator is identified is somehow tangential. What is fundamental is that the value of the victim is restored. And in this case, the value of the victim decreased because his name was used for the purposes of personal land interests. And in this respect, in this regard, George, Jack's brother, once told me, our dead relatives should rest in peace. So we might ask, how could Jack rest in peace if his name was being used for the purposes of a dispute between two sisters over a piece of land? In other words, I think that the reason why making use of the name of a dead relative was seen as a wrongdoing is that for the Quarai people there can be no good life as long as there is no good death for their ancestors. Now, I won't go through the two central conceptual categories developed by Stewart and Strathern and the part of my material that fits within them, and I will deal immediately with the outcome, in particular with its material form, the tafuliae, this long necklace made of round chips of shell, which is considered by the Quarai people as the appropriate form of compensation. And I would argue mostly for symbolic reasons. Indeed, as you can see, both ends of a tafuliae culminate with stripes of red cloth, which represents the blood of two people who, for whatever reason, look at each other as separate. But also the central bit is red. It is made of a shell named Romo, which is the most rare and precious type of shell. So we see that the symbolism of blood is reproduced at the extremes and at the end of this tafuliae. And the Quarai people tend to understand such aesthetic arrangement as being indicative of the particular function of a tafuliae, namely to turn duality and difference into unity and sameness, which is why the tafuliae is considered the appropriate currency for marital transactions, because it unites people that previously look at each other as separate. In other words, when they are giving a tafuliae, they're making a statement about each other's relationships. When Jane paid compensation to George, she was making a statement about herself and her family as members of the Gilbert Camp community. And I think that this process of self-description and identification with the members of a community and separation from hostile strangers is what put the compensation mechanism into effect, and is actually what the chiefs were after when they formulated their judgment. Now, there is one last question, if I still have a little time, that I would like to attempt to answer, which concerns Jane. As I said before, why was Jane seen as much responsible as Rhoda, even if it was Rhoda who caused the big trouble? But before attempting to answer, I would like to highlight a relevant point, which is Jane paid her compensation at the end of the meeting straight away. And the reason why I find this detail interesting and somehow surprising is that Solomon Islanders, as many of us know, do not usually walk around with $1,000 in their pockets. $1,000 is the monetary equivalent of this kind of tafuliai, more or less. So the fact that she came to the meeting with such a sum on her proves that to a certain extent she was expecting to be asked to compensate. And the fact that she was expecting what eventually happened proves that she found for some reason the outcome reasonable to expect. But why? I think that at this point a concept I mentioned earlier might be of help. Before I said that the main purpose of a compensation is not to identify the perpetrator and seek the reparation from him, but rather to restore the value of the victim. In other words, what is fundamental is to identify the person who is responsible for giving rather than guilty of taking. And in this respect, I would like to quote Marilyn Strathern in conclusion, who wrote that first, compensation enrolls a rhetoric of body expenditure, covering both physical and mental exertion based on an image of body process as the giving out and taking in of resources. What is embedded as substance in artifacts and bodies is the energy with which people have acted. So, in other words, the energy with which people have acted is embedded in the objects of compensatory transactions. So, with the wrongdoing, some sort of substance is subtracted from the social space, and the disequilibrium so created has to be reconverted into equilibrium with the reinsertion of an appropriate and proportionate amount of substance. And my argument, in conclusion, is that the Quarai people were able to set such compensation mechanism into effect thanks to the mutual cooperation of the local chiefs, or at least the people who are called this way, and the local police. I think that this is a stark illustration of their commitment to live in Gilbert Camp as moral people. And I hope that my work helps to counter the popular caricatures that tend to represent them as fundamentally squatters, criminals, and violent raiders. Thank you very much for your attention.